Okay, quick music disclaimer here. I do not own the rights to this music, which belongs to the rightful owner, who is the intoxicating mind of Dr. Frankenstein. So he made my intro and my outro, and I hope you guys enjoy. Check them out on Spotify and YouTube, and no copyright infringement is intended. Have a good day.
A clear choice of good versus evil, of right versus wrong.
Twisted Tales.
So tuning back into Twisted Tales, folks. So tonight's story, I'm going to talk about Clifford Olson. So he was born January 1st, 1940. He died September 30th, 2011. Our good friend here was a convicted serial killer who confessed to police for murdering 11 children and teenagers, roughly between the ages of 9 to 18. So he did this all in my favorite decade of all time, the 1980s. So Clifford was born in Vancouver, British Columbia. He died in Label, Quebec, Canada, while in police custody. So there's just a little introduction, and we're going to fire off some early day stuff here. So the timeline of his murders, although he spent most of his time in jail, when he got out from 1980 to 1981, he pretty much just went on a killing spree up until his arrest. The date of his arrest was August 12th, 1981. Now, Olson was one of 4 children whose father ended up, he was a milkman, and he was also, growing up in Richmond. And as far back as elementary school, he was known to be a bully, just like a low-level petty thug, right? Eventually, he started moving on to tormenting cats and dogs, and he always ended up getting into fights in school. And so usually being the one who got the worst of it, he spoke to his father at one time after a fight. He said, "Dad, I'm going to be a boxer, and I should start training." And eventually, former boxing coach Tommy Ewell had nothing but fond and positive memories of the good boy. He remembers Olson to be like a runner-up in a 1954 Bronze Glove tournament. He was once deemed the most sportsmanlike boxer in the Golden Gloves tournament at that time. And early days, after he learned to box and, he won all his tournaments and shit, he still got into fights in the meantime. So he could just, because he had the confidence and skill to even up the score. And every time the bully tried to torture him or bully him or whatever, he relentlessly beat the crap out of them. And, his dad said, maybe that's his trouble. That's because he had one hell of a chip on his shoulder. In his early days of school, he went to Campbell Junior High School. So he pretty much just skipped classes, didn't really go that much, and eventually dropped out completely at grade 8. So living with his parents until he was sent to jail for a B&E when he was roughly 17 years old. A B&E being a breaking and entering. And it seemed that dropping out of school had made his criminal activity kind of shine on. So who knows where he would have ended up, or if he'd taken a different path if he had focused on his studies and completed his courses. And even in school, he had a rep of being a bit of a show-off, deliberately misbehaving, trying to be the focus of attention from his school peers. He was a compulsive talker, and nobody could get a word in edgewise when he was around. This occurred to him that his compulsiveness could kind of, turn into a form of control, and he was easily able to manipulate people. He was a little bit of a loner, but being a full-tilt bully at heart with no close friends, it was easy for Olson to find trouble, whether it be scamming people out of money, selling out-of-date lottery tickets, stealing milk and the milk money that was left on porches, or tormenting local dogs and cats throughout the neighborhood. I believe he had once been rumored to have smothered 2 local pet rabbits at one point. His parents, Clifford and Leona Olson, were pretty much just ordinary people. His mother, Leona, was a prairie girl before she had moved to Vancouver, and that landed her a job at a local fish cannery. Clifford Sr. was a milkman, and delivered milk in one of the last areas that had the horse-drawn wagons. So, that's pretty cool to me. My grandfather was actually a milkman when I was growing up, and we always used to go for rides with him. Just a great time, right? They had lived in a fairly small house near the exhibition grounds on the east side, and that was actually by the Pacific National Exhibition Grounds. And that was around the same time that Clifford was born, that his parents were, up and coming. So Clifford Olson was actually born New Year's Day, and it turned out to be one of the celebrated New Year's babies at the St. Paul's Hospital in Vancouver. So he was born 10:10 p.m. There was also New Year's prizes to be had as well. So an awesome silver spoon and a case of canned milk. But the family, they just had the runner-up prize. And that would have been a baby book and a dainty gift from a local drugstore. Cunningham's, I believe it was. So eventually the family moved to Edmonton, Alberta, returning to the West Coast after the war. This is where Clifford was about 5 years old. So he was settling into a more modest house. This was located on Gilmore Crescent, about an 80-home community in a growing suburb of Richmond. And that was actually built by the government for soldiers after World War II, just so they can come back from the war, have some place to stay, or even during the war, right? Depending. And in 1956, he was 17 years old and working at a local racetrack, the Lansdowne, I believe. And even at a young age, he was a troublemaker still, right? So Olson soon received his first jail sentence. It was about 9 months for burglary, but he ended up escaping, only soon to be recaptured. By the time Olson was roughly 41, he pretty much had 4 years of his adult life as a free man. So the Lower Mainland Region Correctional Institute was one of the many prisons that he would spend time in over the years. Even though serial killers have some sort of traumatic event or some sort of family abuse that eventually put them on a psychopathic path, there was none of that in Olson's upbringing. His parents and siblings were just amazing people. They didn't break the law, and they helped Olson when they could. So, it's not like he wasn't looked after, anything like that, right? But eventually, they had to give up hope that he could never be rehabilitated. The local newspapers had brought shame to their family for all their son's actions. Most certainly, this disrupted their lives over the years. But all they could do was try to repair the damage done to their lives. And being one of Canada's well-known serial killers, even as a young teen, he had no sympathy or remorsefulness. And which, as a man, he still had trouble with all these and with the law. And even from 1951 to 1981, that's well over most of his life being in trouble with the law. So back in 74, while he was in the BC pen, British Columbia, Olson had attacked a 17-year-old inmate in a sexual nature. And upon his release, he had decently assaulted a 7-year-old girl in Nova Scotia. And this kind of descended him into the beginning of his sexual deviancy and criminal activity. Between 1957 and 1980, Olson was out of prison for roughly 3 periods of his life: 1964, 72 to 73, and 1978. And his first kill was in 1964, roughly again in 72, 73, and possibly 78. So all in all, he claimed he murdered about 50 victims, and most of them just transients or young people over the 7 states: Washington, Oregon, California, Illinois, New York, Louisiana, and Florida. So later in the years of custody, he was boasting to killing about up to 100 victims. Obviously, this was just utter bullshit, and he just wanted to see what kind of reaction he could get out of the people for his false claims. So, his 71-year-old life, 50 of those years were spent in prison. That's a long fucking time. And, everybody has little tales of him from jail, from inmates, and, prison guards. One time, he tried to sway his lawyer for immunity if he identified the Green River Killer, who killed about 50 prostitutes. Another time while in prison, he began to tamper with the 1-cent stamps to try and increase their stamp value. Eventually, he received a warning of prosecution from Canada Post themselves. He scammed about, $1,200 a month in old age pension payments from our beloved and friendly government. So, he also sent porn pictures and letters to politicians, Mostly all this shit was just about, horrible prison conditions and just a barrage of complaints from Olson. And even though we know that, he killed a few people in the years up to his release in the 80s, his big murder spree in 1980 gave him a year of relentless killings, It pretty much just marked him a staple amongst the higher tier of serial killers. So, it's brought his notoriety, to another level. And, this was just a time before sex killers, Before Paul Bernardo and, before the pig farmer Robert Pickton. There was fucking Clifford Olson. In 1976, he was serving a sentence and was placed with a cellmate, Gary Francis Marcoux. In turn, began to give the information of crimes orchestrated by Gary. He gave this information to authorities. So, within these stories that they both shared with each other, they began to pique Clifford's sexual interest in children. So, by the age of 40, Olson had racked up over 100 convictions for different offenses that range from DUIs, driving under the influence, to rape. Maybe prison terms turned him into a hardened criminal, especially if he shared a cellmate with a child killer. Like I said earlier, Olson was a snitch in prison, giving evidence to police of letters and maps, and somehow persuaded Gary to write a confession to murders that he boasted about to Olson. In turn, this probably taught Olson to learn his own methods of killing. There was a letter stating that Marcoux dumped the body of 9-year-old Gianna Douve at Weaver Lake. So, Weaver Lake was a camping ground area in the coastal mountains overlooking the valley over East Vancouver. So the letters between the men had described in graphic detail about how Marcoux lured the little girl to his car from her trailer park in Mission, a city located in lower mainland of British Columbia, roughly 50 yards from their halfway house that he was residing. He bought her ice cream, then raped, strangled, and mutilated her before leaving her tied to a tree near Weaver Lake. He also provided a map to Olson from Pemberton to Whistler on how to drive to the murder site. Her body was actually found on July 1st on Canada Day, and Gary was further prosecuted, and his sentence was increased for all this. So after all this shit with Marcoux, Olson had served his time and had since been released. So back in 1980, Vancouver's just a very huge city. Expo 86 was nearing. Olson ended up terrorizing the province that you could once call safe. So hitchhikers and other transients went missing more frequently from the highways. Telephone poles were littered with missing person posters, and some had initial warnings that a serial killer was on the loose and were to be aware of their surroundings and suspicious people. So this man pretty much just robbed Vancouver of their innocence, right? Bringing attention to folks that something may actually lurk in the shadows and possibilities of other serial killers elsewhere. Olson had, he owned a construction company, so he hired young boys and girls with promises of money and countless hours of work. I mean, I'm sure that there were actually some that actually did work for Olson just to make his shit-ass company legit, but there's also a lot that became his unsuspecting victims. So most times he would actually pick up his victims midday, offer them a ride to a job or a job site, just to eventually sexually assault and murder them. So, Surrey, British Columbia is a spot where Olson killed his first victim upon release from jail in 1980. He abducted a 12-year-old girl, Christine Weller. He strangled her with a belt and stabbed her repeatedly. The body was actually found on Christmas Day. On April 16th, 1981, Olson killed a 13-year-old girl, Colleen Marion Dagnalt. 5 months later, her body was found. April 22nd, 1981, 16-year-old Darren Todd Johnsrud. He smashed the boy's head in with a hammer and left him lying in a ditch. May 1981, about this time, Olson married his wife, Joan Hale, and she had given birth to their son, Clifford III. He was actually accused of molestation of a 5-year-old girl who had been one of his neighbors, but the charges actually never stuck to him due to lack of evidence. 4 days after his wedding day, Olson abducted a 16-year-old girl, Sandra Wolfsteiner, as she was hitchhiking home from her boyfriend's house. Olson pretty much just likely offered her a job, persuading her to go, up to a cabin at the woods. And he eventually just smashed her in the head from behind and killed her. Also, in an interview, Olson said that she only had $10 on her when he searched her pockets. He became enraged because she said that she had about $100 on her. Police didn't overly go into the depths of trying to gather any info on this, as they thought she was just, another runaway. And there was no suspicion of foul play. So, how fucking wrong they were on that one, eh? June 21st, Ada Court, 13 years old. She was on her way to see her boyfriend, and she never got there. Kind of like she just up and vanished. So nothing looked like she had run away, as her school locker and her clothes were all still intact. They later found a skull and jawbone near Weaver Lake that actually identified as hers through dental records later on. July 1981, he killed 6 more children. 9-year-old Simon Partington, 14-year-old Judy Cosma, 15-year-old Raymond King, 14-year-old Sigrun Arnd, 15-year-old Terry Lynn Carson, and 17-year-old Louis Chartrand. So during the time of these murders, he was well known by police, and they actually began to put him under police surveillance. The murders of these young kids in July, pretty much put all the police on radar. So the reason being that the victims of both sexes, they varied in age, and they were killed in various ways. So most being bludgeoned to death or strangled. Most of his victims' bodies were dumped in various locations. So he kept little souvenirs from each murder as well. And after the murder of Judy Cosma, he found an address book on her, and he began calling some of her friends and uttered threats to them, stating that he would kill them too. So Olson eventually, the investigation kicked up. So because of some of the surveillance and that he lived in the Surrey area of BC, plus his criminal record was like a fucking mile long, he was brought in for questioning, but eventually, due to insufficient evidence, he was released. So even though he wasn't an easy guy to follow because they had surveillance on him, pulling random U-turns on police, driving down one-way alleys, throwing it in reverse, changing direction. He rented lots of rental cars as well. He traveled probably 20,000 kilometers in about 14 rental cars in a 2-week period. He also one time drove an escort for 5,500 kilometers. Later on, Olson took the ferry to Vancouver Island, and he broke in and robbed 2 residences. So he headed back north towards Nanaimo, and it's just like an old coal mining town. So along the way, he pulled over to pick up 2 hitchhikers. It just sucks because, back then it was just an easy way to travel. But today, we all know better, and that crazy things can happen to you if you, go with strangers. You just need to be careful. So after 3 hours of police following Olson, his car began to swerve and weave along the highway, eventually hitting a shoulder at the bottom of the hill. This was just a little bit before the turnoff to Long Beach, but eventually slowed down and had turned off onto a logging road. So 2 RCMP officers pulled up behind him on the dirt road, and they just tried to block his escape. Now, up the road, the Mounties seen 3 people in the distance passing around a bottle of booze, and Olson began to yell at both women. So they decided to move in on him, and he spotted them moving in, and he ran to his car and tossed her in reverse. So just headed towards the unknown, to him, police roadblock. And he was eventually arrested. The police checked on the girls, who were very confused by the whole shit show situation, but were totally unharmed. Now, he was charged with impaired and dangerous driving. His car was impounded, and Olson was brought to lockup. After searching the rental vehicle, they had found Judy Cosma's address book. This jumped the investigation up full fucking tilt. So, Olson was charged with first-degree murder of Judy, and he eventually gave a full confession on the whole matter. Now, cop named Bruce Northorpe. He led the investigation into Olson and, had about 150 officers trying to piece together all the case evidence and info that would eventually be indulged over to the media. And, he just had to figure out how to take everything all in and give it all out best he could. And eventually he learned for the first time, about the $100,000 deal that was orchestrated by Olson. So let's get into that. Yeah, and there's part one of Clifford Olson. So part two will cover the $100,000 deal, his arrest, court, jail sentencing, death, and we'll go from there. Just been busy, so, I've been trying to fire off shit the best I could. Have a lovely week, folks. Take care. And I'll fire part two off here pretty quick.
Twisted Tales.